Hello, all. What is poetry? Were you challenged or were you asked? Well, most of us would probably choose to evade it. The situation will be similar to, I quote, if you asked, I know. If you asked me, I know not. A certain instinctive sense what constitutes poetry we all have, but to translate that sense into exact language seems to be a Herculean task, or it seems difficult if not impossible. We can probably best define what poetry is by saying what it is not. To begin with, poetry, unlike prose, cannot be paraphrased. If you could sum it up succinctly in any other fashion, you would not write the poem. One can talk about the theme of a poem, for instance, but it's the poem itself which conveys the ultimate effect. A poem is the best possible expression of what the poet wants to say. Some might say that the form and content of art, in this case poetry, is untranslatable. In trying to define poetry, we often end up thinking archaically. We think of the work of writers such as Keats or Shakespeare, for instance, as in some way defining what poems should be like. Their way of writing poetry is assumed to be the right way to do it. We mistakenly presume that true poetry always involves a special elevated vocabulary as if this will earn us our stripes. It is surprising how strongly such misconceptions endure. Whereas language and its conventions are not static. In fact, it's a poet's job to locate and help define the conventions of his or her era. Now, coming to the definition of poetry, or as it is cited in Wikipedia, poetry is literature that evokes a concentrated imaginative awareness of experience or a specific emotional response through language chosen and arranged for its meaning, sound, and rhythm. Apart from this definition, I wish to quote some important, like prominent personalities, poets about poetry. Dickinson said, if I feel physically as if the top of my head were taken off, I know that is poetry. To quote Wordsworth, emotion recollected in tranquility. When it comes to Coleridge, that willing suspension of disbelief for the moment, which constitutes poetic faith. And Robert Frost said, no surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader. That's what poetry is, according to him. So I hope this must have been interesting to understand what is poetry